fireman and a driver on a steam engine, while appearing glamorous, it's not an easy job. There's a lot of physical labour involved and you need a head for heights. Both driver and fireman have to inspect every part of their engine, including having the ability to climb on top of the boiler and the cab, especially on saddle tanks where the water cover is situated on the top of the engine. The men or women are expected to climb up to the top of the tank to take on water. Depending on the run, this is expected to be done around 3 or 4 times a day. But while standing on the engine is not a desirable place to be, and in most cases downright dangerous, for 2 types of locomotive you had little choice: camels and camelbacks. John Wotton was the manager of the Philadelphia and Reading Railroad and noted that in the mines there was a lot of waste products from the coal screening process known as coal. The coal was almost free and plentiful, but standard engines simply couldn't use it. Wotton experimented with excess coal and developed a way to use it as a fuel source. He knew that coal had a very slow burn and standard fireboxes didn't do too well, so to help with the burn, he needed to increase the surface area of the firebox and have a thick carpet of coal and create a better draft. When placed on a locomotive, the firebox had to be huge, like hang off the frames huge. This presented a problem for the cab. Because of its large size, the firebox obscured the driver's view, and there simply wasn't enough room for the vast array of controls that the driver would need. The only option available was to move the driver, and the only available space on the locomotive was either on top or straddling the boiler. And this is where the difference between the 2 locomotives lie. A camelback is an engine with the cab straddling the boiler. The cab would sit in front of the firebox, giving the driver that all-important view. Depending on which way the engine was travelling and depend on which side the cab of the engineer would get in from. The fireman would stand exposed on the tender and would feed the Wotton firebox from a small platform. A camel locomotive has the same concept, but instead of the cab straddling the boiler, the cab would sit on top of it like a weird tortoise. It was more roomier and was frequently used as inspection engines. There were some rather serious drawbacks to this type of cab design. In the days before 2-way radios, there was no real way to communicate between driver and fireman if they were separated. They could use hand signals, but that only worked when both of them were in line of sight. If the driver became incapacitated, there was no one as backup available to stop the train. The only other drawback was the dangerous position the locomotive design put the driver and fireman in. If anything went wrong with the boiler and the safety features failed, or the fireman failed to spot a problem, the driver was quite literally sitting on a bomb, and there was the added danger of the rods and debris on the line. As the driver were effectively over the rods themselves, they were putting themselves in great danger if they were to fail. It wasn't so much fun for the firemen either. Despite the roaring firebox, many firemen were at risk of exposure from the exposed position on the tender plate. But while the engine had serious drawbacks, due to the fuel it burned, there was very little smoke and it was perfect for passenger runs, and they were pretty speedy, running about a mile a minute. The first 460 10-wheeler locomotive was built in 1877, and Wotton was proved correct in his assumptions. The engine made a huge saving on the fuel and was a huge success. So much so that the 10-wheeler was taken abroad to tour Europe to show off its design. It couldn't, however, run on European lines due to the bridges and tunnels being too low. In the end, it was Gilbert Steff who came up with the plan to move the cab from the top of the engine to straddle the boiler in front of the firebox. Because the driver's view was now unobstructed by the firebox, other designers were keen to adopt this ideal, and soon the idea was pretty conventional, coming in many variants and styles. By the 1920s, camelbacks were in daily use around the network. They were nimble and rather strong considering their size, and would average around about 90 miles an hour. They were used mostly on passenger runs and were commonly seen in Philadelphia, Reading and the New Jersey railroads. But as safety standards and boiler efficiency grew, the camels and the camelbacks were becoming more of a concern rather than a help. Several states, uncomfortable with the crew's predicaments, attempted to ban the locomotives running through their states. It went to the federal courts, however the designs were getting rather dated. Newer and more powerful engines were already coming through the pipeline, and one by one the engines were being put out of commission. While not being banned in active use, the engines would go on to be barred from being in active steam ever again by more modern safety regulations. For the majority, their hard work was recognised. Thanks to advancements in mechanical stoking, it no longer became a requirement for the fireman to be at the tender. Therefore, with the stoker doing all the work, shoveling the fuel under their feet, the Camels and the camelbacks were converted to have their cabs moved to be directly under the stokers. Not only was this much safer and both fireman and engineer were once again reunited, having the cab mounted over the machinery gave them a great vantage point seeing over that firebox. It allowed the locomotives to work pretty much to the end of steam. Currently, there are 5 unaltered Camels and camelbacks still around today preserved for the masses, with the Baltimore and Ohio housing 3 of them in their roundhouse, including the only surviving 440 and the largest of the preserved fleet, number 592, weighing in at a whopping 108 tons and carrying no less than 8 driving wheels. It's the only known survivor of the Atlantic camelback and could easily clock speeds of over 90 miles an hour without breaking a sweat. Although camels and camelbacks are now only able to be seen in museums, they must have been quite a sight racing down the railroad in their heyday. For me though, considering the risks, this is one locomotive design that's probably best being a static display.